Hello, humanoids. It's Akbar and Adam. Welcome to episode 22 in our course on the philosophy of climate change. I hope you're having a wonderful day or middle of the night or whenever you're watching this. We continue in our module on climate policies. Today, the Green New Deal. You've heard about it. What's it all about? Let's jump into it. So I've got this broken into 8 chunks, each with a slide or two. Really, the objective is pretty simple. I just want to have you walk away understanding a little something about the Green New Deal. We'll start with the New Deal, and then I'll kind of connect from there to the story of the origins and the development of the Green New Deal. Then we'll lay out actually what is it, insofar as that's something we can answer, because it is a little bit nebulous. And then we'll talk about, I had you watch Naomi Klein's interview. We'll kind of cover that in her case for the Green New Deal. Then I want to cover some criticisms of it. And I also had you read the Nordhaus piece, which gives us an ecomodern perspective on the Green New Deal and sort of lefty climate radicalism, which I think is very interesting in a sharp analysis. And then at the end, just a piece on the way this has gotten politicized in the US. And so a reminder, we're looking at, last time we looked at the UNFCCC Paris Climate Agreement. That's international climate policy. Although there are different Green New Deals in different nations, the focus here is on the US. So we're kind of shifting to a nation state focus away from the international focus. So let's get started. The New Deal. I'm sure you've heard of this. I bet this at least rings a bell from history. This was a massive, multifaceted, complex constellation of programs, public works projects, and regulations sparked by the Great Depression throughout the 1930s with the aim of creating jobs, recovering the economy, and reforming the financial system. It's often forgotten or lost sight of that the Social Security Act was a piece of this, perhaps the most important piece. People just didn't have an insurance policy for getting old and needing somebody to help take care of them. And one of the things the New Deal did was create this welfare state, or strengthen the welfare state, the idea that we're all in this together and we all kind of chip in and we all are then able to share in the wealth. And ultimately, and I want to stress this because I think those who are proponents of the Green New Deal would say the same about the Green New Deal as you would about the New Deal, that this is a corrective for the excesses of financial capitalism, especially the creation of extreme inequalities and volatilities, uncertainties, what we nowadays would call maybe the gig economy, and all of the sort of contingencies that come along with that. A quote here I thought from FDR that kind of sums it up. This was from his first campaign for president. Throughout the nation, men and women, forgotten in the political philosophy of the government, look to us here for guidance and for more equitable opportunity to share in the distribution of national wealth. I pledge myself to a New Deal for the American people. Sharing equitably in the distribution of wealth is a key part of this. Okay, now you can almost tie a connection from the New Deal to the Green New Deal, because the New Deal was successful, or maybe it just got us to the World War II, and World War II is really what pulled us out of the Depression. And that led to the 50s of this time of enormous economic prosperity. But by the 60s, you had the birth of environmental consciousness. And I kind of put from the 60s to the 90s, I'm calling the prehistory of the Green New Deal, because that term wasn't used explicitly. But there were this was the origin of thinking about how can we create a sustainable economy, right? It wasn't until the 60s that became really thematized as a question and then developed over time. Now, the Green New Deal really, in this country, at least in the US, began as the Green Party's platform. And like I said, it does. it is a term of art also in other countries. What often gets cited too, and it's worth mentioning, and I'll link to this in your notes, is Thomas Friedman's New York Times op-ed from 2007 calling for a Green New Deal. It was an influential piece. Fast forward closer to today, the IPCC 1.5C report that you read sparked or helped to catalyze the Sunrise Movement, this collection of youth activists, climate revolutionaries who stormed Nancy Pelosi's office and occupied it, calling for a Green New Deal. That's the picture I've got on this slide here. Those yellow and black are the colors usually of that Sunrise Movement. That turn catalyzed or fed into the development of these Democratic House and Senate resolution, which is when people say the Green New Deal, typically that's kind of what they'll point to is this resolution. So it's a non-binding resolution at the US Congress level, right? So insofar as it exists, that's kind of the way in which it exists still now in 2020. It got taken up in the 2020 Democratic primary run for the presidency, especially by Bernie Sanders, but also others. And then there's been books and white papers and NGOs and other environmental groups sort of picking up, developing, adding more specifics to what the resolution was just a very broad brush thing. And we'll pull some of that language out here in a bit. So that gives you a sense of its origins and its development. Oh, I had to put here too, I'm recording this after the first presidential debate in the 2020 election, where the Green New Deal came up, and I just sort of put "eek" there because it was really messy the way it came about, and there was really no productive dialogue about it at all. President Trump saying that it's going to cost $100 trillion, Vice President Biden both defending it and also distancing himself from it, saying it'll pay for itself and it's not my policy anyway. So I don't know, it was like, oh, like much of that debate, it was sort of unresolved, let's just say. Okay. I guess I'll put the case for the Green New Deal here. You watch Naomi Klein. I think it's fair to say she's a left-leaning critic of neoliberalism. Again, neoliberalism, this ideology or free market fundamentalism centered on privatization, deregulating, cutting corporate taxes, and cutting social services. That's what she is opposed to, that sort of ideology or policy program. What she says the Green New Deal is, and why she supports it, is it's a response to the climate crisis that is on the scale of the crisis itself, offering fundamental changes to every aspect of society. Now remember, talking about metaphysics, right, or framing and the paradox, the, what was it, duck rabbit, what is it? Well, what is climate change? I think the proponents of a Green New Deal have an answer to that. Climate change is not an environmental issue. It's not an issue. And it's not just an environmental issue. Rather, it's a holistic thing. It's intersectional. And you can't address it without addressing issues of economic, social, and racial injustices. Naomi Klein says, look, a narrow carbon approach, that's her terms, taxing carbon, or just focusing on emissions and tech fixes and incentives and subsidies, that tends to lead to a backlash from the working class because it is, or it's at least perceived to be, a rise in the cost of living. And she mentions the Yellow Vest movement, where the slogan was, look, our political leaders with climate change are worried about the end of the world, but we're just worried about getting to the end of the month, as in we live paycheck to paycheck. And if you're going to tax oil and it's going to make gasoline for my car more expensive, I can't get to my job. I can't get enough out of my paycheck to pay the bills. We got to get out of that cycle, she says. And the Green New Deal, she argues, will do that because it's a plan that actually creates better jobs. It makes life better, not more expensive. And it invests in the public sphere and social services, and it would do so through revenues that you would get, at least in part, by taxing corporations. So it requires us, she says, quote, to break every rule of neoliberalism. Okay, but what is it actually? Okay, so she's obviously for it. Well, what's in the darn thing? And so again, um, I'll focus on this resolution because really, as of now in 2020, when I'm recording this, it's really just a set of ideas, plans. It's this resolution. It's not an actual policy. So if you think about the decision process, you have the promotion phase and the intelligence gathering phase, and then the prescription phase where something's actually decided that will have binding consequences. Well, nothing has been decided on the Green New Deal in that sense, at least. So it's kind of, we're in the promotional phase and the intelligence gathering phase with the Green New Deal. And that's how it's another way in which it's different from the Paris Climate Agreement, which has actually gone through the prescription phase. It was decided, it was ratified, right? So there's a lot of diversity in this sort of constellation of ideas that is the Green New Deal. But in general, it's this comprehensive, holistic vision of a new economy and a new social contract that achieves our climate objectives while addressing injustices. In short, it seeks a just transition away from a fossil fueled economy. And one of the specific things it promises is net zero by 2030. Okay, but let me just put a lot of text on the slide. This is directly pulled from the resolution, which I've got in your notes if you want to follow up on it. So be it resolved that it's the duty of the government to pass a Green New Deal to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions through a fair and just transition for all communities and workers, to create a lot of jobs and economic security. See, again, that concern about this volatile and unequal economy that we have now, to invest in infrastructure and industry for sustainability in the 21st century, and to secure for all people of the United States these things: clean air and clean water, climate resiliency, healthy food, access to nature, a sustainable environment, and to promote justice and equity by stopping current, preventing future, and repairing historic oppression of all sorts of groups of people who have been historically oppressed. A major agenda you got from Naomi Klein. They're not doing small ball here, or they're not doing incremental change. They're calling for a holistic, intersectional, new social contract. How would it be accomplished? Well, in the resolution, a little vague, but it has since then been fleshed out by different people who are proponents of it. But in general, look, it calls for a 10-year national mobilization, not just in mitigation, which, yes, the power sector, for example, to be net zero by 2030, what we talked about. Infrastructure, buildings being overhauled, right? Transportation sector being overhauled. But also see that word resiliency, not just mitigation, but adaptation and resiliency. Those are two terms that are often used interchangeably. But we're going to invest in making us more resilient in the face of climate that's already baked into the cake, and the climate that's always changing anyways. So you have this 10-year mobilization on all these fronts: mitigation and adaptation. They even mention removing carbon dioxide, by the way. So you could say kind of a low-tech versions of geoengineering are built into that resolution. Also, I just want to highlight here, it would be an inclusive process. That's what's called for in the resolution, not a top-down technocratic government-led process, but a sort of bottom-up process led by vulnerable frontline communities and others like labor unions. Keep that in mind. Criticisms, look, I put a link to a Heritage Foundation piece, which is worth reading because I think it encapsulates a lot of criticisms. It's way too expensive. Okay. At that piece, it calls it the easy button. I don't know if you remember that commercial where, I forget what company it is, but there's just a red button and it's the easy button, and you push it and it changes everything. The whole room is like remodeled. That's what the criticism of the Green New Deal. It's like an easy button. It's a magic thing. It won't happen, right? And even if the US could get to net zero emissions, it wouldn't matter anyways, right? Because climate change is a global problem where all these other economies are chugging out emissions, right? So that's one criticism. I put a few things here in the sub-bullet point to think about how you might counter that criticism, to talk about the way we account for costs and benefits. Because whenever you say something is too expensive, you can say, well, how are you doing your accounting and what judgments are built into it? And I mentioned some things there to think about. The other big criticism, this is socialism, okay? Too much government control. But no, actually, that's what the Nordhaus piece is interesting. He says, no, it's actually not enough government control. So to that in just a second. And at the end, I want to have a note about this other criticism that's just utopian, it's not practical. Well, is that the case, or is it really just too politicized? So I'm going to end this lecture just on those last 2 points. This isn't socialism, and maybe it's not utopian, maybe it's just made to seem impractical because of the way media and politics works in the US. Okay, but first, Nordhaus, you read this piece. I just pulled some highlights out. Look, it's not socialism. The Green New Deal does not call for rationing carbon. It doesn't nationalize any industry. It doesn't seize anybody's property, let alone the means of production. It's not a Marxist program. There's no suspensions of democratic or consumer liberties. And why is this? Well, his argument is even the left has put the market at the center of climate change actor. The market is the big actor. The market, climate change is a market failure, and so to fix it, you have these tools like regulation, pricing, and subsidies. And environmentalists actually kind of like this because it's consistent of their dreams of small, local, decentralized, and egalitarian action. This is really an interesting argument he's making. But he says, the big climate winners like hydroelectricity and nuclear power have to be run by big government. And that's not a market-oriented framework. That is a public goods model, that clean energy is a public good. If you look at it that way, rather than a market failure, you get the involvement of big government driving something on shared values. And he says, this is the reality of renewables at scale. If we're going to meet our climate objectives, it won't be the homespun, small is beautiful vision of environmentalists on the left. It's going to be top-down, centralized, technocratic. Quote from this article: green radicalism, of the kind you might say behind the Green New Deal, insists that capitalism and technology are the problem, but actually at the end of the day, when you're done with all the sloganeering, what are they proposing? Capitalism, right? Just capitalism with some carbon regulations and lots of wind turbines. More from that article. So he says, look, neither the left nor the right have a vision or a way towards this major government-led technocratic solutions that we actually need if we're going to meet the UNFCCC targets. A pox on both their houses, he says. In fact, they're both two sides of the same coin. They both distrust big institutions. They celebrate individualism or localism or the small scale, even though they're totally hypocritical about that, both the left and the right, because everybody relies on these big forces, these big systems and institutions, which are inevitably made possible by big government. So they both, left and right, spin these overly simplistic narratives. From the left, oh, modernity is bad, development is bad. Africans just need a few solar panels and then basically they can live the way they're living. Fossil fuels are nothing but a corporate hegemony. Well, okay, that's just a really skewed vision of things. But on the right, it's also skewed. Markets are totally rational, really. Public investments are always inefficient. Right. Climate change is no big deal, really. So these are just not good narratives to be working with, is what he's saying. Okay, this is the Nordhaus piece. So he says, and he's lamenting this. Nordhaus wants a public goods-oriented, big government, centralized, technocratic control of climate change. He takes it seriously and he thinks that's what has to happen, but he says it's not going to happen. So we're stuck with a market-driven, incremental approach. It's not going to be like World War II mobilization, which so many people with the Green New Deal, they say that's what this is like. It's like mobilizing for World War II. We have to reinvent the economy like we did for World War II. Well, no, we're not going to do that, he says. It's going to be like the shale revolution or Uber. It's going to be these series of sort of incremental market-driven changes that are going to have all of their inefficiencies and unintended consequences that go with it. There's just not enough consensus or trust for a New Deal today. I think that's his kind of conclusion. And so he says at the end, whether we realize it or not, we're all neoliberals now, right? Even Naomi Klein and the Green New Deal proponents. So that's why I wanted you to watch Klein and then read the Nordhaus piece to get this conversation going in your head. Last piece on this bit about it being too impractical. Look at 2018. This is just a survey from the Yale Climate Communications Center, and this is linked in your notes. You can read this. This is how they pitched it to voters, and in 2018, people didn't know the Green New Deal at all. I'll get to that in the next slide. So this is, for almost all of them, this is the first time they had heard of it, and they gave this description, which is a fairly accurate description about what the Green New Deal is. And then look at this. After they told prospective voters in the survey, would you support it or not? Overwhelmingly, people would support it in a bipartisan way. Look at that. Even 57% of conservative Republicans, 64% of Republicans overall, would support this Green New Deal when it's not labeled with any partisan labels, right? When it's just laid out as, here's some members of Congress, but you don't know which party, right? But then watch what happened. This is a study from Nature Climate Change a year later, 2019, okay? So on the left-hand column, top and bottom, you've got percent of Republicans who have heard about the Green New Deal, and then percent of Democrats who heard about it. And in both cases, when that initial survey was taken, very few people had heard about it. But by 2019, it was all over the news, and lots of people had heard about it. Now go to the right-hand side. What did this do? Well, for Republicans, those who strongly or somewhat support the Green New Deal, support went way down, okay? And it went down the most with people who watch Fox News more than once per week. For the Democrats, look on the right-hand side, bottom box. What did it do? Stayed relatively flat overall, right? So, I don't know. What does this tell you? One thing it might tell you is once a policy platform gets labeled with one of the partisan labels, it's inevitably going to become polarized and lead to the kind of gridlock we've talked about in this class. So that may be one of the lessons. Okay, hopefully enough on the Green New Deal to kind of at least get you caught up to speed what's going on with this thing. So much more we could say about it, but I'm way over time. We'll end with Akbar saying, maybe we should like abolish political parties, feeling radical, my space junkie, feeling funky. Well, until next time, as always, be good, and may the force be with you.